Would Uber and Lyft leave California if the latest bill about reclassifying independent contractors as employees were to actually pass? Hey everyone, this is Kevin the Apptrepreneur, and I have not talked about this topic particularly yet because personally I didn't even realize this was a topic that was in the conversation. Yes, I've been reading a lot of articles about how Uber and Lyft are very unhappy with the AB5 bill that's currently going through California. Yes, I'm very well aware that they dislike it so much they are actually lobbying their drivers to sign petitions and write letters on their behalf, and they are doing what they can to fight. Heck, they are even offering benefits and long-term retirement plans without actually offering a raised, rate, of course. So we do know that Uber and Lyft really, really hate this idea. And of course, to be perfectly honest, I've said it before, some people don't believe me, I don't particularly like the idea either. I would have definitely preferred to stay independent contractor. However, they have had years to fix the problem. They have not. And I'm convinced that if we were to let them off the hook, they would simply not do anything to help us. They would go back to their old ways, maybe throw like a little bone, and then they may even take it away at some point because you're giving them all the power, and I think we are at a point in time where Uber and Lyft need to not have the power anymore. Therefore, I actually very much am in favor of them being regulated by the government and seeing what a regulated Uber and Lyft would look like, and that has a lot of people concerned on whether or not Uber and Lyft would leave California, and I think it is fair to look and ask, is that a real possibility? What is the precedent for things like this? And should we be concerned about that? But before we talk about any of that, let's have a word from our sponsors. Times are changing for gig workers and the gig economy, and there are a lot more gigs from a lot more companies than there used to be. That's why when people ask me where they can go to find resources for the gig economy, I recommend gigworker.com. At this site, you can see what other gig workers are doing and discover better opportunities from industries, companies, resources, and even a forum where you can talk with other people in the gig economy. Gigworker.com is a great resource site, whether you work for Uber, Lyft, Postmates, DoorDash, TaxRabbit, Thumbtack, Upwork, whatever. There's a gig for you and there's a forum for you on gigworker.com. Gigworker.com for all your gigs. Alright, so now that we've gotten that intro and the sponsorship out of the way, let's discuss seriously what are Uber and Lyft's real chances for leaving California if AB5 passes. Because here's the thing, no one's actually said that they are going to leave. Uber and Lyft haven't even hinted that they might leave, which is actually unusual for them. And I think the fact they haven't even hinted at it speaks volumes about the pickle they really are in. See, there has been 2, maybe even technically 3 precedents that show how Uber and Lyft might actually react. The first, and this is probably what people are basing most of their fears and concerns on, is Austin, Texas, where Austin, Texas were going to require Uber and Lyft to fingerprint their drivers. Uber and Lyft famously got out of Austin, Texas, which, led the way to Arcade City and I think another rideshare company taking their place, because they oppose so much to the idea of being fingerprinted when they said they're independent contractors, they don't need that. By the way, I don't see what harm fingerprinting can do. It's just Uber and Lyft being big babies about the whole thing. Now, they eventually came back to Austin, Texas when that rule was more or less amended so that they didn't have to do that. However, it did show that Uber and Lyft were willing to take their ball and go home. However, there was something to keep in mind in that situation. With Austin, Texas, they were leaving one city. Granted, it was a big city, and I'm sure they lost a lot of money when they left. However, it wasn't the whole state. Had they been asked to leave all of Texas altogether, then guess what? They probably would not have left at all. At least I think they would have. Also, keep in mind, there was a very different feel back then. At that time, Uber and Lyft were darlings by the public and the drivers. Both the general public, the drivers, the investors, and even most Congress people were on Uber and Lyft's side. They were providing a great service, they were creating good jobs, it had decent pay, people could do what they wanted. It was a paradise, and so nobody really wanted to go against Uber and Lyft. Why Austin, Texas singled them out, I kind of forget, to be perfectly honest. I think they just felt this was something they needed to do, and they were willing to go up against them, and they did suffer a little bit for what happened. So much so that there was enough pressure to let them back into the city, and thus they eventually did. Now, what's the other situations? Well, the other situations involve New York City, of course, because New York City actually did threaten with a... I know it doesn't quite work out this way in practice, but for argument's sake, let's just say what it is, what they called it, because this is what they want to call it in California. They offered a minimum wage to the drivers and a cap on the vehicles, of which Uber and Lyft were a little bit more bullish, but a little less so at the same time, because they threatened like that their business would be harmed and they would leave, and then it came to pass, and they ultimately didn't. They complied. They complied because what are you going to do? Are you going to cut Manhattan and Times Square out of the equation? Of course you're not. So they just dealt with it. And in some cases, they even dealt with it by suing New York itself. Now, again, I don't think that is a statewide thing. I think that was more or less a citywide thing. I do think if you go to like Rockefeller, New York, caps limits on the on the Uber and Lyft vehicles are probably not a thing. I don't know. New York is super complicated, and despite people's best efforts to explain it as best they can, I still don't fully understand it because I actually get different stories from different people, and that's why I try to avoid talking about New York as much as possible. However, again, we have a situation where Uber and Lyft were strongly against certain rules being in place, but unlike Austin, Texas, they didn't leave. They simply complied, and it seems like things are working out just fine for them. The third case, and this is the one that definitely is the most mixed, is that Seattle, Washington became the first city, and by extension the first state, to actually say that drivers could unionize. Now, I think that whole thing is still mired up in some legal debate, and I don't know if they can unionize yet. However, Uber and Lyft did, of course, I don't know if they threatened to leave, but they definitely said it would ruin our business, and the thing is, Seattle, Washington, whether it's finalized or not, will eventually become the first state and city to allow, because Seattle's a city, not a state, I know that, folks, will be the first place to actually allow drivers to unionize like employees would. And Uber and Lyft are still there. Now let's go to California. Here's what we do know. We do know that AB 5 would drastically change the economics of Uber and Lyft. For that matter, we know that in both their S1 filing reports, they have admitted that if they had to pay drivers minimum wage, they would likely be adversely affected. Now, on a side note, I want to point out to investors that a company that keeps saying over and over again they can't afford the bare minimum wage is probably a company you want to be looking into before you invest real money in. However, that's just me, and that's a side note anyway. So we do know ultimately, though, that it will cost them a lot more money. And from a video I have done recently, it could add as much as $0.5 billion. And here's the scary thing about it. That is just California. That's not even taking into the rest of the country. If everyone else were to do this and Uber and Lyft had to start accounting for those expenses, their losses would probably, at the very least, double per quarter. They won't go from losing $1.5 billion every 3 months. They might go to losing $2 to $3 billion every 3 months. And that is something neither Uber or Lyft want. Of course, they could change the rates. They could charge what the product's actually worth. They could have a more realistic expectation that Uber and Lyft will always be a service people use, but it will not be a service that can completely replace public transportation or even car ownership. They might have to look at all those factors. However, I do believe they can survive. But would they actually leave California? Well, that is the tricky question, because precedent shows no, they won't. I mean, here's the thing. Austin, Texas was an anomaly, because when it comes to once other states started getting into their own regulation, Uber and Lyft probably realized the same thing a lot of people realized. You can't leave all the states that are going to regulate you, because they're all going to have some sort of rules, and it's probably best to just work with whatever cards you've been dealt, because then you're just cutting off your nose to spite your face. I mean, someone actually commented that, Uber drivers want Uber to go out of business because they've been screwed. Talk about cutting off your nose to spite your face. I disagreed. I said Uber drivers, honestly, they want, speaking of nose minus itching, they want Uber to pay them well and don't mind if the companies suffer a little bit in the attempt to get them to pay them better or treat them better. And yes, some will probably lose their jobs and they will probably regret this. However, right now the situation is so dire, they're willing to do that. Uber and Lyft are kind of in the same boat at this point. If they were to get out of California and Lyft, they would be making a point, but they would also be cutting off their nose to spite their face. California is a huge market. Heck, they're headquartered in San Francisco. It seems really odd, and it doesn't look very good for a publicly traded company to be operating outside of California and yet not actually, serving California. That is just something that looks really bad. Now, Uber and Lyft could move their offices somewhere else, and in fact, I actually think they should. I don't know why they have to be in Silicon Valley. I don't know why they can't go to Ohio or Oklahoma or Kentucky and actually build like a new little city, like, how should I put this? A new economy in one of the lesser states where they would have a total market and they could actually convince people to move out there, because with what they pay, people could get huge farms and plots of land. That's neither here nor there, though. Would Uber and Lyft actually do it? I'm under the... That's the funny thing, because before any of this came up, I was actually talking to my dad on the phone years ago. And when I started talking about, like, Uber and Lyft need to be careful because they will be regulated and they might be forced to pay a certain amount of money that they don't want to pay. And my dad said, no, Kevin, they will not pay it. They would rather go out of business than pay it. And I do think it's a real possibility. Keep in mind, they just went public and a lot of the early investors have cashed out. Uber and Lyft need to show they're making money, and it might be a situation where it's like the chickens have come home to roost. They can't keep up the charade any longer. And companies do this sort of thing all the time. When there were the fires in Paris, California, once it was even suggested that PG&E might be responsible for the fires, they filed for bankruptcy protection. Not because they were actually bankrupt, but because they want to protect themselves from the lawsuits that actually were to come. For that matter, 4Kids Entertainment, when they were going to lose the rights to the Yu-Gi-Oh franchise, actually, they filed for bankruptcy and called Konami's bluff. And that actually might be a better example. These are good examples because here's the thing. Bankruptcy is kind of like a stay of execution. Yes, you've made your point, and yes, you're fighting. However, it royally bones you in every other aspect, because the amount of companies that have come out of bankruptcy and survived are far fewer than the ones who have. Now, Uber and Lyft are not exactly filing for bankruptcy. It's not an apples-to-apples comparison, but let's look at it how it is similar. If Uber and Lyft were to leave California, they would be making their point for self-preservation. However, it would be boning them in many other ways. They would be giving up a huge, huge market. Their growth might actually be stifled a little bit because California is a technology hub. Once they leave, someone else will come in. We have already discussed how cab drivers are actually making their own apps. And by the way, Austin, Texas made a few apps when Uber and Lyft left. So if Uber and Lyft left, it would be a very short point to be made because someone else would fit their shoes, be willing to work with California, and it might be difficult for Uber and Lyft to come back home as a result. On top of it, it would show that Uber and Lyft truly do not want this to happen, and other states will know that they have the leverage because they can't leave every single state that regulates them. So what happens when Seattle, Washington solidifies, their attempts to unionize the drivers, and then New York actually says, hey, you know what? Let's expand this whole car cap and minimum wage thing that we've established, and let's make it statewide. Are Uber and Lyft going to leave Washington and New York? I highly doubt it. They would not be a very successful business, which means I think Uber and Lyft would have bigger incentives to just deal with California and deal with the new reality that is fast approaching them. And what they might want to do is, if California's bill does pass, they might want to work extra hard to treat the drivers good in the other states to prevent the other 48 states from implementing minimum wage laws and employee status laws themselves. So, in my opinion, I think it is unlikely Uber and Lyft are going to leave California. It's one of those things that is way easier said than done. California is way too big. Why do you think the rest of the nation follows California when they decide to do something? I don't say that as someone who lives from California and is a narcissist and think we're the best state in the world. I actually think we've got major, major problems, and I'd probably rather live in one of the other states, to be honest. Much prettier over there. But California does have a huge influence on everyone, and this would be one of them. If they fall in California, they know what's coming with the rest of the states, and that's what they are afraid of. And here's my advice to Uber. If you somehow escape this bill and it doesn't get passed, I would not say pop the champagne cords. I'd be getting to work, and I would be making 180 days of change and beyond a reality, and I would really be doing what you can to make the drivers and customers happy with good compromises, good pay, because guess what? It will come back in another form, and you can't beg your way out of it every single time. However, those are my thoughts on the matter. I would love to know what yours are. So, comment below. Like, favorite, share, subscribe. If you enjoy my videos, consider becoming a Patreon member. It's totally optional, of course, but even as little as $1 a month goes a long way to helping the channel run smoothly, and you get access to my Patreon's exclusive blog. Also, subscribe to the Aptrepreneur Vlogs channel. We have more content over there. It's different from what's here, but I hope you'll enjoy it nonetheless. And if gas prices are getting you a little down, check out the GetUpside app below. It's totally free, but you get cash back on every gas purchase. And finally, if you want to talk to me or other fellow rideshare drivers, check us out at the Aptrepreneur Hangouts on Facebook. And as always, flame responsibly. Have a good one.